There's a detail about Dale Earnhardt that almost nobody talks about. His first race car was hot pink.
Nobody trades paint like Dale.
He does have that black Monte Carlo.
Yeah, he's got that black Monte Carlo.
But remember one thing, when he first started, his car was pink.
No, pink?
Pink?
Pink, and he's never gotten over it.
Oh, man, pink.
Not on purpose. He and a few friends had mixed up the paint. They were going for avocado green, got the formula wrong, and came out with something that looked like a flamingo. They couldn't afford to redo it. So Dale Earnhardt, the man who would one day terrify every driver in NASCAR wearing black, drove a hot pink 1956 Ford onto a dirt track in Kannapolis, North Carolina, and raced it anyway.
I drove a pink race car the first year I started racing, so his first car I ever drove was a pink car. And I'm not going back to this because of that, but this is just a neat old car because it was original paint. And this was a great color back in 1957, the old coral pink. It really wasn't called pink, it was called coral.
That's the story right there. That's Dale Earnhardt in one image. No money, no resources, no fallback plan, just stubbornness and the absolute refusal to sit still. But the real story, the one that explains who he actually became, is darker and more complicated than any pink Ford. Let's go back to the beginning. April 29th, 1951, Kannapolis, North Carolina, a town that didn't technically exist. That's not a figure of speech. Kannapolis had no mayor, no city council, no city taxes. It was the largest unincorporated community in the United States, meaning one company essentially owned everything: the homes, the streets, the police force, the hospital, the movie theater. All of it belonged to Cannon Mills, the textile giant that had literally built the town from farmland in 1905 to house its workers. At its peak, Cannon Mills employed 25,000 people and was the world's largest producer of sheets and towels. Rents ran about $5 a room per month. Workers called themselves lint heads, not with shame, just with the matter-of-fact plainness of people who called things what they were. Ralph Dale Earnhardt was born into this world, third of 5 children, oldest son in a white one-story mill house on Sedan Avenue at the corner of Coach Street. His father, Ralph Lee Earnhardt, worked the cotton mills before racing took over. His mother, Martha, held the family together for decades in that same house. The neighbors, the Oliver brothers, lived nearby. The whole ecosystem of Dale's early life existed within a few blocks. Now think about what a few blocks meant in that context. No local government, limited upward mobility, mill wages that were deliberately kept below the national average thanks to right-to-work laws that crushed every serious union effort. The options for a young man in 1960s Kannapolis were stark: mill work, farming, military, or, if you had a specific kind of talent and an even more specific kind of obsession, racing. Behind the Earnhardt house, Ralph had converted a 2-door garage into a shop. That garage is as important to this story as anything else in it. Winning all the time was hurting attendance. Let that settle in for a second. He was too good. They banned him for it. But here's what made truly different, beyond the winning. He was an engineer, a self-taught mechanical genius who approached racing like a problem to be solved, systematically, from the ground up. He was among the first, possibly the first, to truly understand and use tire stagger, which means deliberately fitting tires of different sizes to improve handling on oval tracks. He carved custom tread patterns into his tires based on the specific characteristics of each individual track. He installed crash bars in the driver's door, a safety innovation that the International Motorsports Hall of Fame credits with saving lives. He maintained 5 race cars, 2 sportsman cars for asphalt, 2 for dirt, 1 modified. He arrived at every track completely prepared, never turned a wrench trackside. Ned Jarrett, a NASCAR champion himself and one of the sharpest minds the sport has ever seen, said, "Ralph Earnhardt was absolutely the toughest race driver I ever raced against." Ralph also mentored Bobby Isaac, who would go on to win a NASCAR Grand National Championship. He influenced a young engine builder named Robert Yates, who became one of the most respected figures in the sport's history. And in 1957, Holman Moody, the premier factory-backed Ford operation, offered Ralph a full-time Grand National ride. He turned it down. He could race 4 or 5 times per week near home, earn competitive money, and be there for Martha and 5 kids. The Grand National purses didn't justify uprooting all of that. It was a principled decision. It also meant that Ralph Earnhardt spent his entire career one tier below the national stage, brilliant but largely invisible to anyone outside the Carolinas. His son would not make the same choice. Dale grew up in that garage, not metaphorically, literally. He was in there constantly, absorbing mechanical language before he could fully speak it, watching his father build and rebuild and tune and test with a precision that looked like intuition but was actually applied intelligence. Ralph had a rule: arrive at the track ready to race. No scrambling in the paddock, no emergency fixes at 6 p.m. on a Friday night. You did the work beforehand or you didn't deserve to run. Dale absorbed that. He also absorbed the opposite lesson, the one his father never intended to teach, which was that talent without resources is still hunger. Ralph could outperform everyone on the track and still never quite escape the financial tightrope. The winnings kept the family going, but there was never a cushion, never anything extra. By the time Dale was 15 or so, the exact timing is honestly not well documented. The small local tracks of that era didn't keep formal records. He was hanging around the garage more than anywhere else. School was not working out. He tried 9th grade twice, gave up the second time. His own words on this: "I tried the 9th grade twice and quit. Couldn't hang, man, couldn't hang." Ralph was furious. Here's the irony that you have to sit with. Ralph Earnhardt was himself a 6th grade dropout. He knew exactly what limited education cost you. He'd lived it. And when his own son made the same mistake, he pushed back hard. By multiple accounts, the school decision strained their relationship for a real period of time. Dale later described his father as the biggest influence on my life, in the same breath as acknowledging Ralph had opposed his dropping out. That tension, a dropout father furious at a dropout son for dropping out, is not a simple story. It's the foundation of something much more complicated. The clean version of this narrative says Dale quit school to race, but at 16 he wasn't racing in any organized way. He was drifting, doing odd jobs, hanging around the shop, trying to figure out what came next. The decision to race professionally evolved over years, not in a single moment of clarity. What came next was work, a lot of it, for very little money. Pumping gas at a filling station, working the floors at Cannon Mills, doing wheel alignments at Punch Whitaker's shop in Concord, welding at the Great Dane Trucking Company, building cars from junkyard parts in his father's old garage with his brothers Danny and Randy, getting on the track, crashing, rebuilding, doing it again. He married young, 17 years old, a girl named Latane Brown. Their son Kerry was born in December 1969. The marriage lasted maybe 2 years before it fell apart, and what happened next is one of the most painful chapters in this whole story. According to Dale's sister Kathy, Latane left while Dale was at work one day. She took Kerry and cleared out the trailer. What she left behind was 1 fork, 1 knife, 1 plate, 1 cup, 1 sheet, 1 blanket, and 1 pillow. Dale was 20 years old, broke. His son was gone, and whatever grief or anger he felt, he had nowhere to put it that wouldn't cost him something. He eventually signed over custody rights. He reportedly settled child support debts by handing over $900 from a Goodyear tire test. For the next decade or so, approximately from when Kerry was 3 to when he was 16, there was essentially no contact between them. Dale sent Christmas presents every year, but no visits. Kerry didn't learn who his biological father was until roughly 9th grade. He eventually drove himself to his grandmother Martha's house to reconnect. The first meeting with Dale was, by Kerry's own description, quietly awkward. He opened the garage door, it got quiet, and Dale said, "Hey, son." That's all. No dramatic confrontation, no tearful reconciliation scene, just two people beginning to figure out what they were to each other after 15 years of absence. Dale Earnhardt has been genuinely gracious about this publicly. He said he doesn't hold a grudge, that things happened for reasons, that they eventually had a real relationship before Dale's death, but the years were gone. That's not a small thing. The culpability question here is genuinely unresolved. Dale's family emphasizes that Latane and her new husband blocked contact. Others have suggested Dale simply prioritized racing. Latane never gave a public interview before her death in 2021. The history here belongs to people who lived it, and the full picture isn't available. By the early 1970s, Dale was married again to Brenda Gee, whose father, Robert Gee, was a NASCAR car builder, a connection to the racing world, at least. They had 2 children, Kelly, born in 1972, and Dale Jr., born October 10, 1974. The family lived in assorted apartments and trailers. That's a direct quote from a biographical reference. And Dale was constantly borrowing money from other drivers, hoping he'd win on Sunday so he could pay it back on Monday. He was also, around this time, beginning to win. And then his father died. September 26, 1973. Ralph Earnhardt had been having heart problems, had been hospitalized earlier that year. He'd recovered enough to win a couple of races at Concord Speedway in the summer. On that September morning, he was at the kitchen table working on a carburetor. Martha found him there. He was 45 years old. A few important things to clarify here. The 2004 ESPN film about Dale depicted him finding his father in the garage. That's a dramatization. Multiple sources, including Dale's own accounts, confirm it was the kitchen and it was Martha who found him. Small detail, maybe, but accuracy matters when you're talking about a moment this significant. Dale was 22 when it happened. He stayed angry for a year, by his own admission, and then, slowly, he converted that anger into something he could use. Martha gave Dale his father's race cars. And now the real story started. A few months after Ralph died, a Kannapolis man named Gray London, who ran a sandwich shop and had known the Earnhardt family for years, helped Dale put something together. They formed Earnhardt Racing Team, Inc., 50-50 partnership. London invested roughly $20,000 to purchase and prepare an asphalt sportsman car originally owned by Harry Gant, who at that point was the dominant driver in that class. Dale's contract called for $140 a week and 15% of winnings. That doesn't sound like much. It wasn't, but it was a salary. It was structure. And critically, it meant switching from dirt to asphalt, which was the direction NASCAR's top series had already moved. The 1974 switch to asphalt racing was the hinge point of Dale's career. Nobody wrote about it at the time. There was no ceremony, no announcement. But that decision, to start learning the surface that the big series ran on, was what separated Dale from the dozens of talented Carolina short track drivers who never went anywhere. He spent 1974 grinding through sportsman races, learning asphalt handling, borrowing his father's mechanical vocabulary and applying it to new conditions. At some point that year, he also drove in an unofficial invitational exhibition race at Metrolina Speedway. Not a points race, not an official cup start, but his first real brush with that level of competition. He was running with Richard Childress and Cale Yarborough. He spun out late in the race while running third. Childress finished ahead of him. File that away. May 25, 1975. Charlotte Motor Speedway, the World 600, the longest race on the NASCAR schedule. Dale Earnhardt made his first official Winston Cup start that day. He was 24 years old, married with a young daughter and a son born 7 months earlier, financially unstable, with no sponsor and no clear future in the sport. The car belonged to Ed Negri, a veteran independent operator from Washington State who had made 338 career Cup starts on budgets so thin they barely existed. Negri's son Norman was the crew chief. The car was the number 8 Dodge Charger. Dale qualified 33rd. By the accounts of people who were there, the race exposed something about Dale that needed fixing. He was accustomed to 50-lap regional races. 600 miles was a different animal entirely, and he struggled with the physical demands of it, dehydration, endurance, the mental management of a long event. He finished 22nd. He earned $2,425. He also finished 1 position ahead of Richard Childress, who was 23rd in his own car that day. Now think about that for a second. 2 men who would eventually build one of the great partnerships in American sports history, both running underfunded cars in the same race, both grinding through a 600-mile event in the Carolina heat, finishing 22nd and 23rd. Ed Negri, for his part, had been skeptical about putting this unknown kid in his car. He said afterward, "People said I was crazy, but the more they talked against him, the more determined I was to let him drive." Between 1975 and 1978, Dale made maybe 9 Cup starts total. 9 starts in 4 years. Each one was a negotiation. Find a car owner willing to take a chance, scrape together enough preparation, show something fast enough to be invited back. The 1976 Dixie 500 at Atlanta tells you everything about the margins of this life. Dale was driving Johnny Ray's number 77 Chevrolet. He'd actually talked to Richard Petty before qualifying and gotten some advice that improved his lap times. The race was going well. With 50 laps left, he was running strongly, and then Dick Brooks's broken car crossed into his path. Dale's car barrel-rolled 3 times. He walked away with a cut hand. His first thought, by multiple accounts, was about Johnny Ray, not about himself, about the car. "I tore up Johnny Ray's car, and man, that's all he's got." Ray told him not to worry about the car, just be glad you're alive. That exchange tells you something about the ecosystem Dale was operating in. Small teams, single cars, every piece of equipment irreplaceable. The financial cost of a crash didn't fall on sponsors or factory programs. It fell on people like Johnny Ray. By 1978, Dale was driving Will Cronkrite's number 96 Ford at Charlotte, a former Bud Moore car, solid equipment. He qualified 28th, finished 17th, his best Cup result to that point. And then the Dixie 500 at Atlanta, 1978. Rod Osterland's number 98 Chevrolet. Osterland was a California businessman who ran a competitive operation. He had been planning to hire an experienced driver for 1979. Dale started 10th in that race and finished 4th. And the way he drove it, the precision, the patience, the maturity under pressure, changed Osterland's mind completely. Dale Jr. put it plainly decades later. When he lost his dad, he had nothing. Working a job, barely enough food in the fridge, no racing job, and he made it out of sheer determination. The 1979 season with Osterland was when the world found out. Rookie of the Year, podium finishes, a talent that was suddenly impossible to ignore. But that's the arrival. What we've been tracking is the journey to the door. There's a technical dimension to all of this that deserves attention because it goes directly to how Dale developed as a driver. When Dale was running sportsman races in the early 1970s, the gap between his equipment and what the factory teams ran in Cup was enormous. He was working with cars that were several years old, engines rebuilt from salvaged parts, a crew that was essentially his brothers and a few friends. The independent operators who gave him Cup starts, Ed Negri, Johnny Ray, Will Cronkright, were running on fractions of what Petty Enterprises or Junior Johnson's team spent. What Dale had instead was inheritance. Ralph's lessons, the tire stagger, the chassis feel, the meticulous preparation before the car ever reached the track, were embedded in Dale from childhood. He could read a car the way other people read a room. He knew what adjustments to ask for, what the car was telling him through the seat, through the steering wheel, through the sound of the engine under load. There's a story, and this one is documented, of Dale at Myrtle Beach Speedway during a practice session, repeatedly clipping ivy off the wall along the front stretch on every single lap. Not touching the wall, just grazing the ivy, lap after lap, demonstrating a level of spatial precision that is genuinely difficult to explain to someone who hasn't watched elite racers up close. That wasn't showmanship. That was Ralph Earnhardt's garage on Sedan Avenue. Now, some things about this story that need to be said straight. The narrative that Dale Earnhardt dropped out of school to race is cleaner than the reality. He dropped out because he was failing. The decision to become a professional racer evolved over years of poverty and grinding and failure and inherited obsession. The retroactive framing, bold young man sacrifices education for his dream, is tidier than what actually happened. The relationship with Ralph is almost always described as warm and formative, which it was, but it was also strained, complicated, and cut short before it could fully resolve. Dale never got to show his father what he became. That matters to understanding who he was at the wheel. The relationship with Carrie is usually either omitted entirely or reduced to a reconciliation story. The 15 years of absence were real. Whatever the circumstances, and reasonable people disagree about culpability, a father and son lost those years. Carrie's grace about it doesn't erase the reality of it. And Ralph's death itself is persistently mangled in popular accounts. He died in the kitchen, not the garage. At the kitchen table, working on a carburetor. Martha found him. The dramatic version, Dale discovering his father collapsed in the garage, makes for better television, but it isn't what happened. These corrections aren't small. When you're talking about a man's life, accuracy is the minimum standard. What happened after 1975 is the part most people know. 7 Winston Cup championships, 76 victories, the black number 3, $34 million in career earnings, the Intimidator, the man in black. A cultural presence so powerful that when he died on the last lap of the 2001 Daytona 500, the sport genuinely didn't know what to do with itself. NASCAR changed its safety requirements after his death. The hands device became mandatory. Safer barriers began appearing at tracks. The entire culture around driver safety shifted dramatically. That's a concrete, lasting consequence of his life and death. But none of that starts without Sedan Avenue, without the mill house, without the 2-door barrage behind it where Ralph Earnhardt built race cars with the methodical intensity of a man who understood that preparation was the only edge available to someone without money. Dale Jr., years later, reflected on his father's journey with something close to disbelief. I had everything. When he lost his dad, he had nothing. That's the real frame for all of this. The early years of Dale Earnhardt's life are so poorly documented. Small tracks, no records, one wife who never spoke publicly, a father who died at 45, that the gaps in the story are themselves significant. Dale Jr. has said he wants to find every photo from that era, every detail, every hotel receipt. He's described wanting to time travel back to those years. A lot of it is simply gone. What we do have is enough to see the shape of things. A mill town designed to keep people comfortable and dependent. A father of unquestioned brilliance who chose proximity to family over national fame and died before his work was recognized. A son who failed school, failed 2 marriages, failed to hold his firstborn family together, borrowed money from competitors and rebuilt junkyard cars with his brothers, and drove a hot pink Ford around dirt tracks in North Carolina, and refused, absolutely refused, to accept that this was all there was. The championships came, the legend came, the black car and the sunglasses and the intimidating reputation, all of it came. But the foundation was built in failure and grief and a mill-town garage in a company-owned city that didn't even have a mayor. That's not backstory, that's the engine. And once you understand it, you understand why a 7-time champion could still look like someone with nothing to lose, because he knew in his bones, in a way that can't be acquired by any other means, exactly what nothing felt like. That's why the story still holds, not because of the trophies, because of the pink Ford and the borrowed gas money and the kitchen table where Ralph Earnhardt spent his last morning working on a carburetor, trying to make something run better than it did before. That impulse, the refusal to accept the car as it came, ran in that family like a current. It still does.